I didn't know a single act of kindness on a freezing night would rewrite my entire life. I had survived many cold nights, but that night felt different from the moment the wind sliced through the bridge supports like invisible knives, turning the little patch of concrete I called home into something even harsher than usual, something that whispered warnings into my ears that I refused to acknowledge because I had no other place to go. People imagine homelessness as a constant blur of misery, but the truth is more complicated than that, because over time, you develop rituals that help you pretend the world hasn't forgotten you, and mine had always been the same. Count the coins in my pocket, check that my backpack was still zipped, curl up inside the torn army blanket I'd carried for 4 years, and try to sleep before the cold reached my bones. That night, though, the cold arrived early, draping itself over the city like a punishment meant only for the people nobody sees. I was already curled beneath the bridge, my breath rising in pale clouds, when I heard the soft crunch of small footsteps on gravel. At first I thought it was a rat, or maybe someone wandering too close to where I slept, which happened sometimes when teenagers wanted to scare the homeless for entertainment. But as the footsteps came closer, I felt something shift in the air, something that made me push myself up on my elbows and peer into the shadows. That was when I saw him, a tiny silhouette framed by the faint orange streetlight, shivering so violently that his little body looked like it might fall apart at any moment. He couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7 years old, wearing a thin t-shirt that didn't belong to a night like that, and shoes without socks, and for a moment I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, because no child should have been wandering alone through the freezing dark. When he stepped closer, I noticed the way his lips were turning purple, and his arms wrapped around his chest like he was trying to hold himself together. I could feel his fear before he even opened his mouth, but he didn't cry or call for help. He just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes, the kind of eyes that made you realize how cruel this world can be when it chooses its victims. I asked him where his parents were, but he didn't answer, and I could see he was seconds away from collapsing. So I did the only thing I could think of, the only thing I had to offer. I pulled off the army blanket that had kept me alive through countless winters, spread it around his trembling shoulders, and wrapped it tightly until the shaking slowed just enough for him to breathe properly. The cold hit me instantly, crawling across my back like a disease. But seeing the relief in that child's eyes reminded me that kindness is the only thing you can still afford when you have nothing left. He looked up at me with a strange expression, a mixture of gratitude and something else I couldn't name, and he whispered a sentence that still echoes through my mind every time I try to sleep. He said, "Someone told me you would help me." I didn't understand it, didn't know who could have told him anything about me, didn't know how he ended up under that bridge or why he was alone. But before I could ask him anything else, he backed away slowly, clutching my blanket so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and then he ran, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. I debated following him, but my legs felt heavy and numb from the cold, and the night pressed harder against me now that I no longer had my only shield. Minutes passed, or maybe it was an hour, because time drags cruelly when your body is fighting to stay warm, and the wind kept growing sharper until it felt like it was cutting directly through me. Without my blanket, the chill began to sink deep into my muscles, settling in places I couldn't rub warm again, and soon my fingers stopped responding the way they should. I curled myself into a ball, pressing my arms against my chest, trying to trap any remaining heat. But the concrete beneath me felt like ice, and the wind above me felt like iron, and slowly my body stopped shivering, which is never a good sign. When the shaking stops, that means your body is giving up. I tried reminding myself of all the nights I had survived before, all the storms and freezing mornings and the times I thought I wouldn't make it, yet somehow did. But this time my eyelids felt too heavy, and the shadows around me seemed to grow warmer and darker and quieter, as if inviting me to finally rest. The last thing I remember was the sound of distant traffic fading into silence, and the bridge lights flickering above me like dying stars. My vision blurred, my breath slowed, and I let my eyes close because I couldn't keep them open anymore. As everything slipped away, I realized I wasn't falling asleep. I was disappearing into the cold. I expected to wake up on concrete, not inside a billionaire's bedroom. When consciousness finally dragged me upward, it felt as if I were rising through thick, warm water rather than waking from a night that should have ended with frostbite or death. The first thing I noticed was the softness beneath me, a surface so gentle and warm that for a moment I believed I was dreaming, because nothing in my life had ever felt that comfortable, not even in the distant memories of childhood before everything dissolved. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting the underside of the bridge, the stained concrete, the trembling of passing trucks, but instead found myself staring at a white ceiling trimmed with soft gold patterns, illuminated by a glow so warm it made my chest tighten with confusion. I pushed myself up slightly, feeling silk beneath my hands, silk so smooth and cool that I pulled my fingers back as if touching something forbidden. My mind refused to accept the reality in front of me, insisting that I was hallucinating or dying or caught in some fevered state brought on by hypothermia. But the more I blinked, the more the room sharpened into undeniable clarity. The bed was enormous, king-sized, dressed in layers of cream and ivory sheets, the pillows arranged neatly behind my head, and the scent of lavender drifting faintly in the air. A fireplace glowed quietly from across the room, casting soft orange light across polished wood floors and tall windows framed by velvet curtains. Nothing about it made sense. Men like me woke up in shelters or hospitals or alleys, never in rooms so quiet it felt like even the air moved with purpose. My heart began pounding in my chest, a mix of fear and disbelief spreading through me as I touched my own chest to confirm I was alive and not some ghost trapped in someone else's reality. My clothes had been changed. I was wearing a clean, soft cotton shirt and loose sweatpants, far too new and too expensive for a man who had spent years wearing things found in donation bins. I was still piecing together fragments of memory, the child, the blanket, the cold, when a door opened quietly to my left. A woman in a crisp white uniform stepped inside, her hair tied into a neat bun, her posture confident and practiced in the way only someone trained in care could carry themselves. She held a tablet in her hand and glanced at me with a mixture of relief and something strangely respectful, a look I had forgotten how to receive. People usually looked at me with suspicion or pity or indifference, but she looked at me like I mattered, like I was someone she had been waiting to see awake. "Oh, thank goodness," she said softly, her voice calm and soothing. "You're awake. We were getting worried about how long you were unconscious." I stared at her, unable to answer, my throat locking up as I tried to understand where I was and why I was there. She approached with gentle but confident steps, adjusting the blanket around me as if I were a patient paying for premium medical care. Her hands were warm, her touch careful, and the familiarity with which she monitored my pulse made me shrink back slightly, overwhelmed by the foreignness of it all. "Where am I?" I finally managed to ask, my voice rough and uneven, sounding more like gravel than speech. The nurse gave me a reassuring smile, but it carried some kind of caution behind it, as if she wasn't sure how much she was allowed to reveal. "You're safe," she said, which didn't answer anything. "You're in a private residence. You were brought here last night after being found unconscious." Found. That word hit me like a blow. Someone had found me. Someone who lived in a place like this. My mind raced with possibilities. Police, a charity, some good Samaritan. But nothing explained the luxury surrounding me. The nurse continued checking my vitals, all while speaking to me with a politeness I had not heard directed at me in years, asking if I felt dizzy, nauseous, cold, or in pain. Her voice remained steady and composed, yet the undertone of urgency suggested that whoever lived in this mansion had very particular expectations for my care. Every gesture she made, from adjusting my pillow to offering me warm water, felt intentional, precise, rehearsed, as if my well-being mattered deeply to someone powerful. Once she ensured I was stable, she drew back slightly and looked at me with an expression that blended curiosity with respect. "He'll want to see you now that you're awake," she said quietly, almost reverently. My confusion deepened. "Who?" I asked, gripping the blanket with trembling hands, afraid of whatever answer might come next. The nurse opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, I felt the air in the room shift, like the pressure changed or a presence entered that commanded attention without needing to say a word. The double doors at the far end of the room opened with slow, deliberate force, and the sound echoed in a way that made the room feel even larger. The nurse straightened instantly, folding her hands respectfully in front of her. A tall figure stepped inside, dressed in a tailored suit so perfectly fitted that even I, who had long forgotten what wealth looked like, could recognize the difference between ordinary rich and impossibly rich. His presence filled the room like someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms, headlines, and entire cities. He looked directly at me, his expression unreadable but intense enough to send a chill through my spine. Then he said my name. "Glad you're awake, Daniel." Hearing my own name from the mouth of a stranger with power in his voice made me realize I was in the last place I ever should have been. He stared at me like he already knew the role I played in his nightmare. The man who walked into the bedroom carried the kind of authority that didn't need announcing, the kind of presence that made even the quiet air inside the room sit still, as if waiting for permission to move. He didn't rush toward me or speak immediately. Instead, he closed the door behind him with a deliberate slowness, straightened the cuffs of his immaculate suit, and then fixed his eyes directly onto mine with an intensity that sent an uneasy ripple through my chest. I had spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight, to shrink into corners and shadows, but in that moment I felt painfully seen, as though this stranger could look past the clean clothes and the warm room, and into the parts of me I tried hardest to bury. He stepped closer, stopping at the foot of the bed, and his voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, the kind of voice you'd expect from someone accustomed to making decisions that shaped the lives of thousands. "My name is Ethan Hale," he said, his eyes never leaving mine, as if gauging every breath I took. The name struck a faint bell somewhere in my memory, something I might have heard from passing conversations on the street or half-watched television screens through restaurant windows. Ethan Hale wasn't just wealthy. He was the type of wealthy people described in business articles with words like empire, legacy, and power. I tried to sit up straighter, but my body still felt heavy from the cold, and Ethan watched me with a focus that bordered on unnerving. He didn't look angry or relieved or grateful. He looked curious, analytical, like a man piecing together the final steps of a puzzle he had spent all night solving. "You were found last night on the east side," he said quietly. "Barely conscious. My team thought you wouldn't survive the hour." His tone wasn't sympathetic. It was precise, almost factual, and yet something told me he wasn't recounting a stranger's rescue. He had a personal stake in this. I could feel it. Before I could ask him why I was here, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a small remote device. Without another word, he tapped a button, and a large screen on the opposite wall blinked to life. The sudden glow startled me, and I turned my head, expecting a news channel or some medical readout. But instead the screen displayed grainy footage in black and white, captured from a high-angle surveillance camera overlooking the underside of the bridge where I had spent the night. My heart slammed against my ribs as I saw myself on the screen, curled beneath the bridge, wrapped in my worn-out blanket, shoulders hunched against the wind. Ethan pressed another button, and the footage shifted forward, showing the exact moment I heard the footsteps. The exact moment the child appeared at the edge of the frame. I watched myself lifting the blanket and wrapping it around the shaking boy, the two of us illuminated only by the dim streetlight. The memory had felt dreamlike hours ago, but watching it unfold in cold, objective footage made my stomach tighten. Ethan moved closer to the screen, his voice carrying a raw edge I hadn't heard before. "That child," he said, pausing only long enough for the weight of his words to sink into my chest, "is my son." I stared at him, and for a moment the entire room seemed to tilt, as if the truth had shifted the ground beneath me. I looked back at the screen, at the tiny figure clinging to my blanket, and realized how fragile he had been, how close he had come to dying in the cold. The nurse's respectful urgency made sense now. Ethan Hale wasn't just wealthy. He was a father who had been living through a nightmare. "He disappeared yesterday afternoon," Ethan continued, his voice thickening in a way that suggested he had barely slept. "The entire city has been searching for him. Security teams, police, private investigators. But somehow, he ended up under a bridge. With you." He didn't say it accusingly, but the implication wrapped around me like the cold I had barely escaped. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak, telling him everything I remembered: the thin shirt the boy wore, the way he trembled, the strange sentence he whispered before running off. Ethan listened without interrupting, but the more I spoke, the more I could feel the tension building inside him, a tension made of fear, desperation, and something darker beneath it. When I finished, he stepped closer to the bed, his eyes sharpening. "Tell me everything you saw," he said, and this time the command in his voice was unmistakable. Every detail, every sound, every movement. Something led him there, and I need to know what. I tried to recall anything else, but my memory twisted around the cold, the fear, the fading clarity. I told him about the faint sound of footsteps fading in the dark, about the way the boy looked over his shoulder as if someone might be following him, and I watched Ethan's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing with a realization that sent a chill through the room far sharper than the winter night had. He stepped back, exhaled once, and then said the words that made my entire body tense. "The boy wasn't lost," Ethan whispered. "He was taken." And as I stared at him, the truth settled into my bones with a fear deeper than the cold that tried to kill me. Saving the child was easy. Understanding why he was alone nearly broke me. For a long moment after Ethan revealed that his son hadn't been lost but taken, neither of us spoke, as though any attempt to fill the silence might shatter whatever fragile truth had just been placed between us. And the weight of it pressed into my chest so heavily, I wondered if the warmth of the blankets around me would be enough to keep me from sinking beneath it. Ethan paced once, then twice, the controlled, deliberate rhythm of a man clinging to order only because the alternative was unthinkable. And when he finally stopped and looked at me again, the expression on his face had changed from the sharp calculation of a billionaire accustomed to power to the raw torment of a father trying to understand how his world had unraveled. He moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains, as if the morning light outside could offer some explanation he hadn't found in the darkness of the night before. 2 days ago, he said quietly, not turning toward me yet, Liam was taken from inside the estate, not from a street, not from a school, not from a public place. From here, from this house. The words carried a tightness that told me he had repeated them 1,000 times in his mind, each repetition more agonizing than the last. My home is guarded every hour, every entry point sealed, every staff member vetted, every camera monitored, and somehow someone still managed to take my son without triggering a single alarm. He turned then, and for the first time, I saw something break through the hard, polished exterior he wore like armor. Fear. Not fear for himself, but a suffocating fear, born from guilt, from the possibility that he had failed the one person he was supposed to protect above all else. "Whoever did this knew my security systems better than I do," he continued, stepping closer to the bed, his voice low but shaking. "They didn't make mistakes. They didn't improvise. They moved with precision. And when Liam disappeared, every camera inside the East Wing suffered a synchronized blackout." My stomach dropped as I tried to imagine the kind of mind capable of orchestrating something so meticulous, so cold. I shifted slightly on the bed, feeling the soft sheets beneath me, but unable to draw comfort from them because everything about this room suddenly felt too large, too perfect, too fragile, like a protective bubble someone had pierced through without anyone noticing. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of disarray for a man who probably controlled every part of his public image, and he sat on the edge of the adjacent armchair, as if his legs could no longer support the weight he carried. "By the time we realized he was gone," he said, voice cracking, "hours had passed. Hours." His hands closed into fists. "Do you know what it does to a parent? Knowing your child was in the hands of someone who wanted to hurt you? Knowing every minute that passes might be one you'll never get back?" I didn't answer because the pain in his voice didn't need replies. It needed space. He drew in a trembling breath. "The kidnappers didn't demand ransom. They didn't communicate. They didn't send threats or conditions. They simply vanished with him. And that made it worse because when someone doesn't ask for money, it means they want something else, something far harder to bargain with." He rubbed his forehead, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of helplessness that seemed almost impossible for a man like Ethan Hale. But then, late last night, something happened. The lock on a drainage gate near the eastern property line had been tampered with. A trail of small footprints was found in the mud. Liam's footprints. He escaped them. My son ran, alone, in the cold. My breath caught sharply, because in that instant the image of the trembling child under the bridge sharpened with painful clarity, his tiny hands clutching my blanket, his quick, panicked breaths. The way his eyes had darted into the darkness as though fearing someone still followed. I remembered the fear in his voice as he whispered that strange sentence before disappearing into the night. It all made sense now. Why he had been freezing, why he had seemed so terrified, why he had refused to stay near the bridge for more than a moment. Ethan leaned forward, searching my face with urgency. "You said he spoke to you. What exactly did he say?" I swallowed hard, forcing my mind back to those final moments before the cold had dragged me toward unconsciousness. He said, "He's coming." Just that. Over and over. And then he ran. Ethan's posture stiffened in a way that felt instinctual, like a muscle locking beneath the force of an old wound. His gaze sharpened as though something inside him, something buried deep, had just been ripped to the surface. He repeated quietly, but the quietness held the same tension as a storm's final breath before breaking. Did he say anything else? Did he describe the person? Did he point? Did he look scared of someone in particular? I shook my head slowly. No, but I heard footsteps before he appeared. Not his. He was too small to make those. Someone else was there. Someone who stopped just out of sight. Ethan froze completely. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, and I realized with dawning alarm that whatever meaning those footsteps carried, whatever truth they pointed toward, it wasn't just about the kidnapping, it was something far worse, something that made Ethan's face drain of color. "What kind of footsteps?" he whispered. I hesitated, sensing the shift in his tone, the fear tangled beneath it. "Heavy," I said. "Slow, like someone large. Someone who wasn't running. Someone who was following." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was a terror there that hadn't been present before. A terror sharper than anything he'd shown while describing the kidnapping. And then he said the sentence that sent a cold shiver through my entire body. "Those footsteps don't match any of the kidnappers we identified." And as the realization sank into him, his expression twisted into something far darker than fear. Because whatever I had heard last night wasn't part of the kidnapping at all. It was something else. Something he hadn't prepared for. He said he wanted to repay me, but his eyes told a different story. For the rest of the evening, Ethan hardly left my side. His movements edged with a controlled urgency that might have passed for gratitude, if not for the way his eyes kept drifting toward me with a mixture of calculation and unease, as though every gesture I made, every memory I tried to recall, every small detail of how I found his son was being weighed against something he hadn't voiced yet. The warmth of the mansion, the glow of its countless lights, the polished floors that reflected everything too perfectly. None of it eased the tension running beneath the surface of the house, like an unseen current. And even as Ethan guided me down the long hallway, with a hand hovering uncertainly near my shoulder, I couldn't shake the sense that my presence here had changed something he wasn't sure how to control. He stopped at a door near the end of the east wing, a heavy wooden thing carved with patterns so intricate they looked almost unreal to someone who had spent recent years sleeping beneath metal beams and crumbling concrete. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, his voice steady, but too careful, too measured, like a man trying to prevent a conversation from slipping into a direction he wasn't ready to explore. "It's the best room we have available, close to the security wing, close to me." The last part hung in the air longer than it should have. He pushed the door open, revealing a space so absurdly luxurious it didn't feel like a room, but an entirely different world. Soft golden lighting that warmed the cream-colored walls, a bed large enough to swallow me whole, thick rugs I was almost afraid to step on because they looked cleaner than anything my life had touched recently. There were folded clothes on the edge of the bed, a linen shirt, dark trousers, even a pair of shoes that looked new but casual enough not to feel like a uniform. A tray sat on a nearby table with fresh soup, bread still warm from the oven, and a glass of water that sparkled beneath the chandelier. "You should eat," Ethan said, standing in the doorway as though uncertain whether entering the room would break some unspoken boundary. "You'll need it, and you're not stepping outside this mansion until I know you're safe." Safe. The word slipped easily from his tongue, but something in the tightness of his jaw made me wonder if he was talking about my safety or his. I stepped inside slowly, taking in the room that felt so far from the cold pavement I had collapsed on the night before that part of me questioned whether this was reality or some delirious dream I hadn't yet woken from. "Ethan," I said quietly, turning back toward him, "you don't have to give me a room like this. I'm not expecting anything from you." His expression flickered for the smallest second, something like guilt or hesitation cutting across his features before he smoothed it away. "It's not about repayment," he said. "It's about responsibility. You saved my son's life, and I don't let the people who protect my family go back to the streets." Kind words. But his eyes didn't match them. His eyes were studying me again, searching, evaluating, almost waiting for me to contradict him or reveal something he was trying to read between my words. He left soon after, telling me he had a dozen calls to make, security protocols to review, staff to reorganize. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that made the room feel suddenly too quiet, too insulated from the rest of the world. I changed into the clothes he had given me, feeling the unfamiliar comfort against my skin, like a reminder of a life I had once known, a life I had lost long before homelessness had become my reality, long before the world had turned into a series of nights just trying to keep warm enough to see the next day. But even as I tried to settle beneath the soft blankets, even as my body tried to relax into the impossible comfort of the mattress, my mind kept circling back to the people I had seen moving through the mansion earlier. The housekeepers whose eyes darted away when I passed, the security guards whispering near the staircase, the butler who seemed constantly on the edge of telling me something before quickly swallowing his words. There was tension here, hidden beneath polished surfaces. A tension that had nothing to do with me being a stranger, and everything to do with something larger, older, something everyone here felt but no one dared speak aloud. And yet, whenever someone looked at me, there was something else in their eyes too. Recognition. Or maybe fear. It made no sense. I was a homeless man with nothing. No connections, no power, no reason for people in a billionaire's mansion to react as though I carried a secret they were all afraid to touch. And still, the glances persisted. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was their worry about Liam, their stress from the chaos of the kidnapping, their uncertainty about a stranger sleeping under their roof. But something about the way Ethan had looked at me earlier, something about the way his gaze had lingered on my face, my hands, even my voice, it all suggested a worry that had nothing to do with kindness or gratitude. It was as though he recognized something in me, something even I didn't understand. Hours later, after the mansion had gone quiet, after footsteps and murmured conversations faded into silence, I finally drifted toward sleep. But somewhere deep inside, that cold, restless unease kept stirring, refusing to settle. And then, at exactly 2 a.m., I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not rushing, not wandering, not confused. Footsteps that paused outside my locked door. Footsteps that did not belong to Ethan Hale. The handle trembled, just slightly, as though someone on the other side was testing it, deciding whether to come in, or waiting for me to make the first sound. Luxury loses its shine when danger hides inside the walls. The next morning, long before sunlight fully crept across the horizon, I woke to the kind of stillness that felt artificial, the kind of quiet that existed not because a house was peaceful, but because someone, somewhere, wanted it to be silent enough for unwelcome truths to move unnoticed through the walls. The silk sheets were too soft, the room too warm, the air too carefully filtered. And as I sat up, the memory of the footsteps from the night before pressed against my spine with a shiver sharp enough to remind me that comfort did not always mean safety, especially in a house where nothing felt accidental. I dressed slowly, each piece of clothing feeling like a borrowed identity, and stepped into the hallway where early morning light cast long shadows that crawled across the expensive floorboards like living things. The entire east wing stretched in hushed stillness, the kind that didn't belong to a home filled with staff and security. It felt staged, almost rehearsed, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath around me. The walls were lined with portraits of stern men and elegant women, all bearing the same angular features Ethan carried, and their painted eyes followed me with a scrutiny that made my skin prickle with unease. I moved toward the staircase, hoping to find breakfast or noise or anything that made the place feel human again. But the silence continued to cling to every corner of the mansion like a warning. When I reached the landing, I caught sight of one of the maids. Her name was Clara, I remembered, standing frozen outside the study, clutching a clipboard too tightly, her knuckles pale from tension. She didn't notice me at first, but when she did, her expression flickered into something between recognition and guilt so quickly, I almost thought I imagined it. "Good morning," I said gently, trying to sound less like a stranger and more like someone she didn't need to fear. But instead of responding normally, Clara stepped backward, eyes darting toward the hallway behind me, as though she expected someone to emerge from the shadows. You're up early," she said, her voice thin and strained, a poor attempt at casual conversation. "I couldn't sleep," I answered. "Just exploring. This place is big." Her throat bobbed nervously. "Be careful where you explore. Some rooms are restricted." Restricted. In a home. The word settled wrong in my mind, heavy and sharp. Before I could ask anything else, she hurried away, shoes tapping too quickly against the floor, her retreating posture radiating the kind of fear that didn't come from disliking her job, but from knowing something she wasn't allowed to say. I continued walking, letting my curiosity override my unease. Each corridor revealed another layer of wealth that felt increasingly hollow. Marble floors so polished they reflected the ceiling like water. Long runners woven with designs from distant countries. Statues that looked too fragile to touch. And doors so tall they resembled gateways to secrets rather than simple rooms. In one hallway, I paused before a large window that overlooked the gardens, but something caught my eye. Not outside, but above. A small security camera, mounted discreetly near the molding, rotated with a soft, mechanical click, then abruptly froze the moment its lens aligned with my face. A second later, the feed glitched, the light blinking erratically. My stomach tightened. I tested it by stepping sideways. Click. Freeze. Glitch. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was reacting to me, as if someone on the other side of the system didn't want my image being recorded, or didn't want me to know they were watching. The deeper I walked into the mansion, the more it became impossible to ignore the subtle wrongness woven into its luxury. I passed a small lounge and caught the butler, Mr. Rowan, moving quickly through it, his posture rigid, his eyes focused on something in his hands. When he noticed me, he snapped the small velvet pouch shut and shoved it into his pocket, offering a smile that stretched too quickly across his face to be genuine. "Ah, good morning," he said, adjusting his tie. "Master Hale informed us that you may require assistance navigating the home. You need only ask." But instead of feeling comforted, I felt like I had stepped into a performance where every actor knew the script except me. "I'm fine," I replied softly, watching him shift his weight with barely contained tension. "Very good, sir," he said, then walked briskly down the hall, glancing over his shoulder twice as though making sure I wasn't following. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And the house knew it. Later, when I returned to my temporary bedroom to clear my head and gather my thoughts, I opened the door quietly, only to stop cold in the doorway. One of the servants, the same one who had brought my breakfast tray earlier, was kneeling beside my suitcase, which sat half open on the floor where I'd placed it. His hands were buried inside it, rifling through my belongings with a frantic urgency he didn't bother hiding. My worn clothes, my old ID, the small photograph of my mother. He was handling everything like puzzle pieces he needed to verify. "What are you doing?" I asked, the shock in my voice sharper than I intended. The man jolted upright, face draining of color, eyes wide with fear, not guilt, fear. He stammered something unintelligible, bowing his head repeatedly as though expecting me to shout or report him, then rushed past me so quickly he nearly collided with the doorframe. And for the first time, the mansion didn't just feel strange. It felt dangerous. I was being watched, not as a guest, not as a hero, but as a threat. Hours passed in a haze of unanswered questions, strange glances, and whispers that stopped the moment I approached. By evening, I was exhausted from the pressure of being observed by eyes I couldn't see, and I remained in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of what I had stumbled into. Then, just after dusk, when the mansion had settled into that eerie lull again, I heard a soft sound, soft enough to question whether it was real, coming from behind the far wall. A faint, mechanical click, then another, and slowly, impossibly, a thin vertical line appeared in the wallpaper, widening into a seam I hadn't noticed before. The wall itself shifted, and a hidden door began to open. I froze, breath trapped in my chest as the secret passage creaked inward, revealing a darkness that felt like it had been waiting specifically for me. The deeper I went, the more I realized wealth doesn't protect you from monsters. The hidden door opened with a slow, reluctant groan, as though it had not moved for years, yet somehow knew the exact moment I would be standing there, alone, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared for the reality living behind the walls of a mansion that pretended to shine while quietly rotting from the inside. A cold, Draft slipped through the widening gap and brushed across my skin, raising a trail of goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with instinct. Instinct that warned me I had just crossed into a part of Ethan Hale's world I was never meant to see. I stepped inside, drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity too tangled to separate, and found myself in a narrow corridor lit only by a thin strip of recessed lighting that flickered unevenly, creating shadows that seemed to breathe along the textured walls. The air smelled faintly of old paper and dust mixed with something metallic, something sharp enough to settle uneasily on my tongue, and each hesitant step echoed like a warning through the confined space. I followed the corridor until it opened into a small room, a hidden study, or perhaps a war room, its walls lined with shelves packed tightly with binders, files, and sealed envelopes marked with dates, initials, and unreadable codes. But the thing that struck me hardest wasn't the shelves or the boxes stacked along the sides. It was the table in the center, covered in neatly arranged documents, photographs, handwritten notes, and printed reports, all illuminated by a single overhead lamp that cast a circle of light just wide enough to reveal the truth Ethan was hiding. And the truth was not just dark, it was dangerous. I approached the table slowly, feeling the weight of every secret resting upon it, and the first file I opened made my stomach twist. It was a detailed list of threats, anonymous emails, letters, intercepted messages, each describing the same target: Ethan Hale, his company, his assets, but most importantly, his son. Some letters were crude, fueled by rage or jealousy. Others were sophisticated, written with a cold professionalism that hinted at organized criminal involvement. I scanned one typed note that read, "The boy is leverage. Remove the father, and everything collapses." The chilling clarity of the sentence made my pulse stumble. As I flipped through more pages, the story behind Liam's kidnapping began to take shape. Not as a random crime of opportunity, not as a ransom-driven assault, but as a calculated strike embedded within a web of extortion, corporate sabotage, and internal betrayal. Several documents pointed not outward toward distant enemies, but inward toward the Hale mansion itself, revealing lines of communication traced back to staff members, contractors, and individuals who had been granted access to the estate under the guise of loyalty. Ethan had been monitoring them for months, maybe years, trying to determine which one had snapped the thread that finally set the kidnapping in motion. I moved deeper into the room, scanning more binders, each filled with pieces of a story that contradicted the image Ethan had shown the world: the billionaire philanthropist, the devoted father, the man who rebuilt his empire through honest innovation. None of this was honest. None of it was stable. All of it was teetering on the edge of collapse, held together only by secrets hidden behind walls and lies wrapped in velvet. Then I saw something that froze me entirely. A series of photographs were pinned to a corkboard on the far wall, arranged in a pattern that seemed random at first glance, but revealed clear intent upon closer inspection. They showed various angles of the mansion grounds, the staff quarters, the outer fences, and several grainy shots of a van parked near the service entrance. But in the center was a picture of Liam, taken the night he disappeared, standing near the very spot under the bridge where I had found him. What made my heartbeat truly falter was the photograph beside it. A man stood in the background, half obscured by shadows, but the shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the familiar tension in his posture, they struck me with a force that made the room tilt sideways. I leaned closer, scarcely breathing, as memories I had buried long ago rose sharp and unwelcome to the surface. His face was partially visible, enough for recognition to slice through me like a blade. My past, the one I thought had died years ago when I lost my home, my family, my place in the world. That past was staring at me from the wall of a billionaire who believed I was a stranger. Hands suddenly trembling, I touched the corner of the photograph, needing to feel the reality of it beneath my fingertips, needing to confirm I wasn't imagining the man I had spent years trying to forget, the man who had helped destroy everything I once was. But recognition became certainty when I saw the next file. My name printed on the tab, my history documented inside, my old life laid bare in a way only someone with power and reason would bother assembling. And in the middle of it all, the photo of the man who had kidnapped Liam. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, as the horrifying truth settled inside me. The kidnapper wasn't just an insider. He was someone from my past, someone who had once sworn to ruin me, and somehow he had found his way into Ethan Hale's world. The man who ruined my life had returned, this time for a billionaire's child. Standing in that hidden room with my past staring back at me from the corkboard, I felt the air thicken until it was hard to breathe, as if the mansion itself wanted to squeeze the truth out of me before Ethan could ask for it, as if the memory of that man, that destructive force who had once torn my life apart, was strong enough to drag me back into the years I had spent trying to outrun the world he'd burned around me. My hands trembled as I traced the faint edges of the photograph, because seeing his face in a billionaire's secret archive felt like a nightmare folding into another nightmare. The kind of twist that didn't happen by coincidence, the kind that suggested a deeper purpose, one that somehow dragged both me and Ethan Hale into the same gravitational pull. Before I knew it, my mind slipped backward, carrying me to the time before the bridge, before the blanket, before the cold nights and empty pockets and long days where survival became a skill instead of a choice. I had once been employed, stable, proud of the work I did in a small construction firm run by a man named Marcus Ellery, a man who had promised guidance and opportunity, but delivered betrayal with a precision so clean it felt almost personal. He was charismatic in a way that made you lower your guard, the type who shook your hand with a smile while planning the knife he would sink into your spine. I remembered the day everything unraveled, the morning I discovered irregularities in the company's financial records while filing reports, little inconsistencies that grew into unmistakable evidence of a laundering scheme tied to men whose names were whispered with caution. Instead of thanking me, instead of fixing the corruption I uncovered, Marcus turned the entire company against me, crafting an accusation so convincing it wiped out everything I had worked to build. Stolen funds, forged signatures, staged surveillance clips. He framed me with brutal efficiency, and by the time I realized what he'd done, my reputation had deteriorated beyond repair. I lost my job, my rental home, my savings, and the few relationships I still treasured, all within the span of weeks. Marcus made sure no one hired me again in the entire region, and every attempt I made to clear my name only strengthened the illusion he had designed. I fell through society's cracks, landing hard onto the streets where each night reminded me of the man who had crushed my life so completely that survival itself felt like defiance. I swallowed hard as the memories flooded the hidden room, and the anger I thought I buried years ago surged again when I recognized Marcus's face in that kidnapping photo. The fact that he was near Liam Hale the night the boy disappeared meant something bigger was happening, something deliberate and calculated, something that connected Ethan's world of wealth and influence with my world of loss and ruin. It wasn't chance that placed me under that bridge at the exact moment Liam escaped. It wasn't coincidence that led me into Ethan's mansion. Marcus always played the long game, and I was starting to see that I had been pulled back into his poisonous orbit. Footsteps echoed behind me, grounding me back in the present as Ethan Hale appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed urgency, suspicion, and something dangerously close to desperation. His eyes darted over the files scattered across the table before landing on the photograph, still trembling between my fingers. And for several long seconds neither of us spoke, as the weight of unspoken truths thickened the air between us. "I think it's time you tell me everything," Ethan said, not as a request, but as a command, his voice quiet enough to betray the fear he didn't want me to see, the fear of a father who had just discovered that the man standing in his hidden room was connected to the kidnapper who had slipped past his security. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and though he didn't move toward me, the tension in the room made it feel like he had. So I did what I had avoided for years. I told him the truth. I told him about Marcus Ellery, about the betrayal that shattered my life, about the evidence I discovered, and the consequences that followed, about the years spent rebuilding myself only to fall back into the shadows Marcus forced upon me. Ethan listened with an intensity that felt like scrutiny and empathy, battling for dominance, and each detail I shared seemed to connect more dots in his mind, forming a picture neither of us wanted to see. When I finally explained that Marcus was the man in the photo with Liam, Ethan's composure fractured. I watched grief, rage, and terror collide in his expression as he processed the fact that the person who had taken his son was an experienced manipulator who had no limits and no conscience, someone who destroyed lives out of convenience or ego. Ethan took a step closer, his voice rasping as he asked, "Why would he be targeting me?" I shook my head slowly. "If Marcus set his sights on you," I said, "it means he wants something only a man with your power, or your downfall, can give him." Before Ethan could respond, a violent pounding shook the front of the mansion, followed by voices shouting commands, and the unmistakable thud of boots rushing across marble floors. Ethan stiffened, glancing toward the hallway with wide, alarmed eyes. Then the door to the hidden room swung open with force. 4 officers stormed in, weapons drawn, and the leading detective pointed directly at me with an expression that told me judgment had already been decided before they entered. "There he is!" the detective barked. "Hands where we can see them! You're under investigation for involvement in the kidnapping of Liam Hale." As guns aimed at me and Ethan's stunned face blurred in my vision, I realized Marcus wasn't just back. He had engineered this moment too. He wanted me blamed, cornered, and destroyed all over again. I went from hero to suspect in seconds, judged for the life I lost. The cold barrels of the officers' guns didn't touch me, yet I felt their weight press against my ribs as though the weapons themselves carried the entire history of my failures, my past, my homelessness, my mistakes, all of it dragged back into the open like evidence of guilt before I could even speak. I raised my hands slowly, because there was something humiliating about lifting them inside a mansion with floors polished enough to show distorted reflections of my own fear. Something devastating about realizing that no matter how many times I tried outrunning the past Marcus created for me, it could still snap around my ankles like a chain. They forced me into a chair in Ethan's study, the room's warmth suffocating as the detectives circled me with the predatory calm of men convinced they had already found their criminal. The lead detective, Harris, leaned forward with a smirk carved into his face, like he had been waiting years for someone like me to end up under his authority. He slapped a folder onto the desk, scattering papers that showed grainy images of the bridge, the alleyway, and a blurred silhouette carrying Liam. And though the figure wasn't me, though the posture wasn't mine, though everything about it screamed that it was staged, Harris pointed to it as though the case were already sealed. "That's you," he said, voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Right place, right time, same build, same jacket. You expect us to believe a homeless drifter just conveniently finds a missing billionaire's son in the middle of the night?" His words struck deeper than he knew, because I remembered every night I had slept under cardboard boxes, every sideways glance from strangers who assumed criminality lived in the dirt on my clothes, every time I walked into a store and felt cameras turned toward me simply because poverty looked suspicious. Now all those moments gathered behind the detective's accusation, giving him armor I couldn't break through. I tried to explain, but Harris cut me off every time, and each interruption was another reminder of how powerless I was. Another reminder of how easy it was to blame a man with nothing, and how hard it was to defend yourself without money or proof. My voice began to shake, not from guilt, but from the bitterness of knowing Marcus had orchestrated this trap perfectly, using my destroyed past as the foundation for a new crime I had no part in. Ethan stood behind the detectives with a stiffness that didn't belong to the confident billionaire I had met earlier. His jaw clenched, his eyes dark, his fists curling at his sides like he was fighting a battle between fury and reason. When Harris tried to pin Liam's disappearance on me again, Ethan finally snapped. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but powerful enough to silence the entire room. "I brought this man into my home. He saved my son's life. He didn't take him. If you want a suspect, look at the man in that photograph." Ethan pointed to the evidence wall, to Marcus's face, to the threat that had stalked both of our lives from different directions. But Harris dismissed the gesture with a wave of his hand. "We're aware of your business rivalries, Mr. Hale, but nothing we have indicates he was involved. What we do have," he tapped the folder again, "is motive, opportunity, and a man with a criminal history of fraud and theft." The words split something inside me because they weren't true, yet they were truthful in the only way the law cared about. My record wasn't clean, not because I had committed crimes, but because Marcus had rewritten my narrative so effectively that even detectives believed the lies more than my reality. The shame wasn't mine, yet I felt it anyway, heavy and familiar, wrapping around my ribs until I struggled to breathe. Just when the interrogation reached its cruelest point, the study doors flew open and Liam rushed inside, his small voice slicing through the tension like a desperate plea. "Stop yelling at him," he cried, running straight to me with the kind of trust that no police officer could manufacture. His arms wrapped around my waist, and I felt the room shift. Not because of sentiment, but because no detective could ignore the sincerity in a child's voice when he was terrified. Harris stepped back, irritation flickering across his expression. "Son, we're trying to help you. We think he might know something he's not telling us." Liam shook his head fiercely. "He saved me. He gave me his blanket. He didn't take me. He didn't." The detectives exchanged glances, but what came next froze them more effectively than any rebuttal from Ethan or me ever could. Liam hesitated, then whispered something so quietly that we all leaned closer. And when he repeated the words louder, the room dropped into stunned silence. "The man who took me said he knows him," Liam said, pointing at me. "He told me he's coming back tonight." My stomach twisted violently, and Ethan's face drained of color as the implication landed like a bomb. Marcus wasn't done. He wasn't finished. He had planned every step, including this moment, including the accusations, including dragging the police into Ethan's home. And now Liam was telling us the part I feared most. Marcus wasn't hiding. Marcus was returning. The room erupted with panic and shouted orders. But all I could hear was Liam's trembling voice repeating it. The kidnapper was coming back tonight. And he was coming for me. Fear feels different when you know it's coming straight for you. The moment Liam's trembling voice confirmed that Marcus was coming back for me, the entire mansion shifted from a place of uneasy silence to a fortress bracing for war. And the transition happened so quickly that it felt like the walls themselves understood the danger better than any of us. Ethan barked orders to his head of security with the raw urgency of a cornered father. And within minutes, the hallway outside the study filled with armed guards, reinforced door locks slamming into place, and rapid-fire communications about perimeter sweeps, motion sensors, and safe room procedures that sounded more like a military operation than a home responding to a threat. I watched the chaos unfold around me, but the real storm was inside my chest, because fear carried a different weight when it had your name carved into it, when the man hunting you wasn't just any criminal, but the same monster who had destroyed your life once, and now seemed determined to finish the job. Every step I took down the hallway felt heavier, every breath felt tighter, and every memory of Marcus's manipulation returned with vicious clarity, as if preparing me for the possibility that tonight might end the same way the past did, with me losing everything again. But this time, the loss wouldn't be mine alone. Liam walked beside me, smaller than his courage made him seem, clutching the blanket I gave him on the night we met, the fabric now washed and folded neatly, yet still carrying the weight of the moment that tied our lives together. He looked up at me with wide eyes that held too much understanding for someone his age. "Will he try to hurt us?" he asked. And although every instinct in me wanted to lie to protect him, I could only kneel to his level and place my hand on his shoulder, letting him feel the steady heartbeat I was forcing into existence. "He already hurt us," I said softly. "But tonight we don't run. Tonight we protect each other." Ethan stood behind us when I said it, and something in his expression softened. Not pity, not obligation, but a level of gratitude that felt almost painful coming from a man who, until recently, viewed me as a stranger lying half-frozen under a bridge. His voice carried none of the polished authority he wore in boardrooms. Instead, it held something raw. "What he did to you," Ethan murmured, "and what he tried to do to my son. I should have seen the signs earlier. You didn't owe Liam anything that night, but you saved him anyway. I won't forget that." The sincerity in his words almost unraveled me, because it struck a part of me that had been numb for years. The part that forgot what it felt like to be valued. The part that learned to expect suspicion instead of respect. The part that believed people like Ethan Hale only saw people like me as disposable. Hearing him speak with conviction felt like facing a truth I didn't know how to handle. And for one fleeting moment, I wished this night wasn't spiraling toward danger so I could process what it meant for my life to matter again. But the world didn't pause for reflection. Security teams moved through the mansion with synchronized precision, installing reinforced barriers at the windows, testing alarm tripwires, adjusting thermal sensors, and coordinating vantage points around the estate. They argued about Marcus's possible entry routes, debated whether he had inside help, and questioned the reliability of every staff member currently on the property. I could see fear building in their faces, not because of the kidnapping, but because of the man behind it. Marcus had left a trail of destruction across multiple cities, leaving people bankrupt, ruined, missing, broken, and no one had ever managed to catch him. Not even law enforcement. I wondered if Ethan understood just how intelligent and vindictive Marcus truly was. I wondered if he knew that when Marcus wanted someone destroyed, he began by cutting off every escape route long before he delivered the first blow. But I kept those thoughts to myself because fear didn't need more oxygen. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I helped secure Liam's safe room, checked the locks myself, examined every corner of the hallway leading to Ethan's private wing, and allowed the head of security to brief me on emergency routes, backup protocols, and what to do if Marcus managed to get close enough to confront us. Listening to those instructions felt surreal, like my life had shifted from the brutality of homelessness to the danger of high-stakes survival without giving me a moment to breathe between the extremes. As the night deepened, the mansion grew unnervingly quiet again, not with the peaceful silence of a secure home, but with the breathless stillness of an arena before a predator enters. Every window reflected the dim interior lights back at us. Every hallway felt too long, every shadow too dense, and even the air vents hummed with an anxious tension that made the hairs on my arms lift. I stayed near Liam's safe room, positioned between him and the hallway, like a barrier made of bone and memory and determination. Ethan stood near the control monitors, watching the cameras with eyes that missed nothing and feared everything. And for the first time, I felt like we were not two men separated by wealth and circumstance, but two fathers, one by blood, one by fate, bound by a shared enemy. Just as the clock reached a suffocating stillness, the monitors flickered. Once. Twice. Then all at once, The alarms exploded through the mansion in a shrill, piercing cry that sent every guard into motion. The screen closest to Ethan showed the perimeter fence bending. Another showed a shadow crossing the courtyard. Another showed a figure too familiar to mistake. Before anyone could speak, a guard shouted the words that turned my blood into ice. "He's already inside the mansion." When I saw him again, I finally learned why he'd destroyed both our lives. The moment Marcus stepped out of the shadows at the end of the hallway, time seemed to collapse around me, folding every year of pain and humiliation into a single breath that scraped across my lungs like broken glass. Because the man standing there was not just a criminal or a kidnapper. He was the architect of my downfall, the shadow that had ripped my life apart long before Liam ever disappeared. And seeing him in Ethan's home made every buried emotion claw its way violently back to the surface. He looked almost unchanged, with the same predatory expression, the same cold smirk that suggested he was already several steps ahead of everyone in the room. And as he began walking toward us, slow and deliberate, I felt the years of helplessness harden into something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. His voice cut through the corridor with the smooth confidence of a man who had always assumed the world belonged to him. "I knew you would end up here," he said, eyes locked on mine as though Ethan and the guards didn't exist. "You always had a talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." I felt Ethan shift beside me, his body rigid with anger. But I stepped forward before he could speak because this confrontation had grown roots in my life, long before Liam's kidnapping. And for the first time since Marcus destroyed everything I had, I needed to face him without fear. "Why?" I demanded, my voice trembling not with weakness but with years of restrained fury. "Why ruin my life? Why come after this child? What did any of us ever do to you?" Marcus chuckled, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed off the mansion walls. "You really don't know," he whispered, tilting his head as though studying a specimen. "You were supposed to stay small. You were never meant to report anything. When you found those files years ago, you became a threat I couldn't afford. And when you survived what I did to you, when you kept breathing after I erased every opportunity you had, I realized you were a problem I hadn't finished solving. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, not because I feared him, but because his words confirmed what I always suspected. My suffering had never been collateral damage. It had been intentional, calculated, personal." Ethan stepped closer, fury flashing across his features. "And my son?" he growled. "What does he have to do with your vendetta?" Marcus's eyes flicked toward Ethan, filled with the kind of disdain that only envy can create. "Your empire destroyed 3 companies I had interests in," he said. "Your name closes doors I need opened, and your influence makes you untouchable. Except," he smiled cruelly, "your son wasn't." The confession shattered something inside Ethan, and before I could react, Marcus lunged forward, shoving me aside with a force that sent me crashing into the wall. Pain radiated through my ribs, but all I could think about was Liam, who stood trembling behind Ethan, clutching his blanket with wide, terrified eyes. Marcus reached for him with the same casual entitlement he once used to take everything from me, and instinct ripped through me so violently that I threw myself at Marcus again, dragging him backward before his fingers could touch the boy. The struggle exploded into chaos. Fists, grunts, the sound of furniture shattering as we slammed into walls and door frames, years of rage burning through my muscles as I fought a man who had already taken far more from me than any thief ever could. I felt his hands claw at my throat, felt his breath against my ear as he hissed threats he had once whispered through lawyers and forged documents. But now he couldn't hide behind power or influence. Now he had to face me directly, and I wasn't the broken man he left behind on the streets. Ethan rushed in with the force of a father protecting his world, tackling Marcus with a strength I didn't know he possessed, and together we dragged Marcus to the ground, pinning his arms despite his frantic attempts to escape. Security swarmed the hallway, finally able to restrain him with metal cuffs and knee holds, strong enough to stop even a man driven by hatred. Liam sobbed into Ethan's chest, and as I watched them, my chest tightened with the realization that the cycle Marcus created was ending right there on the polished floors of Ethan's mansion. But before relief could settle, a sudden burst of static rang through the guards' earpieces, followed by a panicked voice shouting from the control room. "We have a problem. There's movement in the west corridor. The cameras just picked up a second figure." The room froze. A second figure. Another accomplice. As the guard scrambled and Ethan pulled Liam closer, the radio crackled with 6 words that chilled me more than Marcus's attack. "The other intruder is still inside. I never imagined a homeless night could lead me to a family I wasn't born into." When the second intruder was finally dragged out from the far end of the west corridor, kicking and spitting and screaming threats none of us paid attention to anymore, the entire mansion seemed to exhale at once, as if its walls had been holding their breath through every moment of danger, and I found myself leaning against the railing with a trembling mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, trying to comprehend how a single night under a bridge had spiraled into this storm of violence, truth, and unexpected redemption. The accomplice, a thin, sharp-faced man whose eyes darted wildly from guard to guard as though searching for an escape that didn't exist, refused to look at me, refused to acknowledge the role he played in a plot that had nearly destroyed a child's life. But when the flashing red and blue lights from the arriving police illuminated his face, I recognized the familiar expression of someone who had willingly followed Marcus down the darkest paths. And for a moment I felt a strange, hollow ache, knowing that the people who once haunted my past were finally colliding with the life I was stumbling into. Ethan stayed beside his son the entire time, one hand wrapped so tightly around Liam's shoulder that his knuckles blanched, and the boy, small, shaking, eyes wide with shock, kept glancing at me with a trust that felt almost too heavy to hold, as if he believed I alone had kept him safe, even when the mansion was swarming with guards far more capable than me. And after the police left with both intruders in custody, after the doors were locked and the alarms reset, and the staff finally allowed themselves to breathe again, Ethan turned toward me with an expression so filled with gratitude and raw emotion that I had to look down for a moment, because I had never been looked at like that. Not as a burden, not as a stray drifting through the city, not as a man whose life had collapsed, but as someone who had value, someone who mattered, someone who had done something meaningful. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled in a way I had never heard from a billionaire who had built empires with iron determination. "You saved my son," he said, not as a proclamation, but as a confession, as though the words themselves were too fragile to be spoken loudly, and before I could argue or deflect or insist that anyone in my position would have done the same, he shook his head with a firmness that silenced every instinct in me. "You saved me too," he added, and something inside me cracked, because nobody had ever said anything like that to me. Not when I was drowning in debt, not when I lost my job, not when the lies destroyed my reputation, and certainly not when I found myself on the streets trying to survive nights so cold they gnawed at my bones. He didn't stop there. Ethan asked me, no, insisted, that I stay, not just until the police finished their investigation, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he believed I deserved a chance to rebuild the life Marcus had shattered, and when he offered me a real job overseeing logistics and repair operations on one of his construction teams. A job that actually matched the work I used to love before my world crumbled. My breath caught in my throat, as though the air had turned too thick to swallow. He spoke of training programs, opportunities, stability, and when he mentioned converting one of the guest rooms into something more permanent for me, I felt the unfamiliar sting of tears gathering in my eyes, because for the first time in years, someone wasn't trying to take something from me. They were trying to give something back. Liam tugged at my sleeve then, his small fingers curling around the fabric with the pure innocence only a child can carry. And when I bent down to see what he wanted, he wrapped his arms around my neck with a tight, trusting embrace that erased every cold night I'd ever spent alone. "You're part of us now," he whispered into my shoulder, and the words hit me harder than any blow Marcus had ever landed, harder than the betrayal that ruined my life, harder than the loneliness that had nearly crushed me under the bridge the night I gave away my only blanket. I held him carefully, terrified of doing anything wrong, but he only hugged me tighter, as though claiming me as something his small heart had already decided I was. Family. That night, after the chaos settled and the mansion grew quiet, Ethan walked me down the hallway to the room that was now mine. A warm, softly lit space with clean sheets, a new set of clothes folded neatly on the chair, and a view of the city lights shimmering through the window like scattered pieces of a life I never believed I'd touch again. He placed a hand on my shoulder. A silent thank you. A silent welcome. And when he left me at the doorway, I stepped inside with the overwhelming sense that I was crossing from one version of myself into another. I changed into the clothes he'd provided, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the warmth of the blankets soak into my skin, remembering the freezing concrete from just days before, remembering the little boy shivering alone in the dark, remembering how a single choice, to give away the last thing I owned, had become the thread that pulled me out of the shadows. For the first time in years, I felt safe enough to close my eyes. But when I lay back and my head touched the pillow, something crinkled beneath it. I reached under, expecting maybe a misplaced tag or a forgotten receipt, but instead my fingers closed around a small folded note. Plain white paper, no markings, no handwriting on the outside. My heart tightened as I unfolded it, and in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I read the message written in small, deliberate strokes. "You were chosen." I stared at the note in stunned silence, realizing the nightmare might not be over, and someone out there believed this was only the beginning. If this story kept you holding your breath until the very last line, then don't let the journey stop here.